Hi, I'm Diane Brady, and this is Forbes Newsroom. I am speaking with Will Yakowicz, who is our Vice's reporter. That's got to be the best job in Forbes, Will.
Yeah, it's a good gig. I can't complain.
And we're talking about pot. I'm sure we'll, of course, get into the other vices, but you just did a big piece recently on how we essentially botched the opportunity. I smell it a lot, so how so?
Yeah, my cover story is about basically what you just said, America botching this opportunity to legalize marijuana on the federal level. We're now in a place where, you said you smell it all over the place. We're in New York and Jersey.
City, right?
Yeah, and you really do. And, that is just a quick aside. New York basically decriminalized, they legalized, but a couple years ago they basically said it's now not a crime to smoke weed wherever you can smoke a cigarette.
Right.
So
we will turn a blind eye, so to speak.
Yeah, and now it's fully legal. It's as legal as tobacco, but currently you cannot buy it legally in New York, where the state is now in the process of licensing.
So how do you get it?
Well, like people usually had been doing for decades, which is the illicit market. There's also this thriving gray market in New York. So, on 8th Avenue in Washington Square Park, there's these either pop-up stores or like pure brick and mortar unlicensed dispensaries that sell cannabis products. And, some of them are grown and made here, which is still illegal, or smuggled in from legal states. So made legally in California. And if you go into one of these shops, you'll see products with stickers from California.
Give us an update. How many states are legal versus how many are in that gray zone, and how many are like, no cannabis here, please?
Yeah, so there's 38 states with some form of legalization, and 19 of them have full recreational use, meaning if you're 21 or older, you can go in the store and buy pot just like you would alcohol.
And the squandered opportunity, I think I remember a figure of, what, $72 billion? What is that essentially, if it had been legalized at the federal level, that is what you anticipate the revenue would have been into government coffers?
So no, that's the annual sales per last year. So the legal market, like I said, across 38 states, $25 billion last year in annual sales. The illicit market is $47 billion.
Okay.
So together combined, like if the U.S. would legalize across the board and every state opened a legal market, we're looking at a $72 billion industry.
I'm curious how likely that is to happen, because as with other vices, of course, there's always that moral quandary that people debate. There's legalized prostitution in many parts of the world, and I believe it was a bunny ranch maybe in Nevada had it here. So is that what's holding us back? Like, what's the popular attitudes about pot right now?
I think, it's interesting because it's nuanced. Like, if you ask Americans, should weed be legal, 68% say yes. If you ask, Gallup actually just released a poll, I think yesterday. And that poll was really interesting. They basically took the question to Americans: is marijuana, does it have a positive or negative effect on society? And it's really split. It was like almost 50-50 down the line on the effect on society. And then when you get down to it, like, does that person who answered your question smoke weed? Like 70% of them are going to say it's positive.
I can eat all the peanut butter I want. Stare at my hand as much as you want.
Right.
Not that I have done it, but
of course not. But yeah, so it's, America's attitudes, are changing. And then when you look at bipartisan support, there are indicators of that. The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has his own bill out with Cory Booker and Ron Wyden, both senators. All three of them are Democrats. And then Representative Nancy Mace, she's a Republican, and she has her own bill.
Quite different? It's very similar.
Similar in many ways, but like very different in, as you could imagine, Republican versus Democrat, like taxes. So Mace's bill, very low excise tax. Schumer's bill is a higher excise tax. And like, speaking of taxes, like, this is the reason why we continue to have an illicit market. There's multiple reasons, but taxes and the banning of interstate commerce. So right now, marijuana is still a Schedule I drug, which is, according to the DEA, it's a drug. Heroin is in the same category, which it has no medical value and high potential for abuse.
Back from reefer madness kind of mentality, right?
Yeah, and these laws were made in the 70s, so this is it's obviously reefer madness was before that, but still, like, the war against drugs, like Richard Nixon launched that and made marijuana illegal. So first take taxes. So marijuana is a controlled substance, like I said, Schedule 1. So the tax code, the U.S. tax code, there's a tax code for everything, right? If you pay or accept political bribes, you should, when you file taxes, you should, note that. There's a tax code called 280E, and that is basically anybody who traffics a controlled substance needs to pay under this tax code, and it prevents most deductions. So the only deduction you can take is cost of goods sold. So that's like an effective tax rate of like 60%.
Right.
And there's a fascinating history behind how that tax code created. But
so we need to make it friendlier for the people selling pot to make a higher profit? Is that the
essentially, like, across the board, this isn't, profits are really tough to come by. There are companies that are profitable, obviously, right? But there's, like, the saying in the industry, like, if you're talking to analysts and investors, they're like, companies are profitable, and then 280E happens, and it takes away all the profits off the table.
Right.
Not exactly true, but it really
and both of
takes
these bills would address that?
Yeah, both bills would remove cannabis from Schedule 1 status and basically regulate it similarly to alcohol and tobacco.
What about psychedelics, since we're hearing a lot more these days about that also rolling out? Is that a similar issue, or do you see that playing out differently?
In many ways, psychedelics has jumped ahead of marijuana. So, but it's a really different category and different approach to legalization.
Right.
Where, marijuana started as, the legalization, like the fight for legalization really started as a medical fight, and that is where psychedelics are. But, those, for whatever reason, and, the research behind it, there's much more research behind psychedelic substances like LSD and psilocybin, which is the active ingredient to magic mushrooms, than there is marijuana. So, those substances, as was marijuana, they were legal, but, if you take something like LSD, Sandoz, the Swiss chemical company, they manufactured it and sent it to psychiatrists all around the world and said, hey, guys, this is a, hugely important molecule. We don't have a use for it. Why don't you see if you can have a use for it? So there was hundreds of studies that took place from, with alcoholics, with people with PTSD. And now we're coming to a point where, like, this research renaissance is in full swing again. In the 70s, it died down, and, the federal government, made these substances illegal. And now they're coming back. And institutions like NYU, Johns Hopkins, Imperial College at London have dedicated departments to look into this. So now there are companies that are trying to bring to market a FDA-approved medicine.
Often for like depression or people facing end of life. I know there was a study at NYU about that. When we look at so if that rolls out, you think it'll roll out in a different way? It won't be the same conversation around what we're talking about with pot, widespread distribution, a profit incentive, basically changing the taxation system. It'll probably be administered through, you think, basically big pharma or the equivalent? Yeah,
or startup pharma companies.
Right.
But like there are multiple companies, and I think it's really thought that MDMA, Molly, but MDMA-assisted psychotherapy and psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, it is thought like in 5 years this is going to be a thing. There are already clinics for ketamine. Ketamine is legal. It's a anesthetic for pets and children because it's safe in terms of you basically can't OD and die on ketamine, right? So there are already clinics that have said, look, here's a legal molecule. It's essentially a psychedelic. It's really not. It's technically not. It's a dissociative anesthetic, but it triggers similar effects in your brain. So there are clinics and companies that are running these kinds of businesses where if you're depressed, if you're anxious, and a doctor says you should try this, and it's usually like you've tried SSRIs, you've tried antipsychotics, anti-anxiety, whatever your issue is, you've gone through all the medicines that you could, and you still haven't, treatment resistant is the phrase, and then you try this.
Right.
So that is what this is going to be, and it's really a different paradigm.
Okay.
You wake up in the morning, take Prozac every day. This is not that. You might do it once a year.
Well,
So-
it's interesting. So as we sort of sum up here, and I think there's obviously a lot more to come on the legislative front with pot. I'm curious about being the Vice's reporter when you actually sort of approach people like, the way we talk about psilocybin, not a vice necessarily. Pot, like, are we reframing, since you look at this whole space, what is and is not a vice? How do you define it yourself?
Well, the Vice's desk, it's really, tongue-in-cheek. It's not meant to be judgmental, and it, admittedly, maybe it's a vestige
Vice can
of
be
the
a good
past.
thing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, everybody needs a release, right?
Right.
But, it's more tongue-in-cheek than anything. It's not a judgmental thing. But, it's, classically, really how I kind of have framed my outlook around it is like these are regulated industries, right? And, TV is a regulated industry. But when it comes to substances, I think what falls into my beat is anything that was illegal or is currently illegal and that is transitioning out. And that's the most fascinating thing, every once in a while, once in a generation, society gets to see something go from the illicit market to the legal market. My grandparents saw alcohol go from, legal to illegal to legal again.
Oh, that worked out well, didn't it?
Yeah. It did. And then my parents saw gambling. And then, what we get to see now is marijuana reform and then, psychedelic reform too.
Great.
Yeah.
Anything else on your radar, especially as we look at election season and this sort of red state, blue state divide? We've certainly seen with abortion rights, backtracking. Is that a risk, do you think, here where, pot that has been legalized, people are saying, wait a second, we don't like it, and a regime change at the state level can actually change the fate of these industries?
I think it's going to be really hard to roll something like this back. Like, we did see with abortion, right? And that blew everybody's minds. Like, nobody thought that would happen.
Right.
But, with this, I think it really, it is nuanced, but at the end of the day, cannabis isn't a red versus blue issue. Like, more people, if you take one state like Mississippi, more people voted in Mississippi for marijuana legalization than they did for Trump. So if you're looking at red states and you're looking for like who's more popular, weed is more popular, right? So weed is not
weed
this
for president.
Yeah, definitely. And like that's the idea. I think people look at weed and think, oh, it's crazy hippie Democrats, right? But that's not the case. Like people smoke weed across all creeds, political affiliations.
Right.
So something like this, this issue is really framed two ways, economic, right? Like tax revenue, it's going to be a boon to your state. Although that is the Achilles heel for that is if you tax something too much, especially something that has a very sophisticated illicit market like marijuana. Marijuana has been sold in New York and all across the states.
We saw it with cigarettes on reservations, right?
Right,
Like all of a sudden it was a cost issue. And
it still is. Like Eric Garner, was murdered because he was selling untaxed cigarettes, right? So that is a really, especially in a state like New York, the tax arbitrage, like, U-Haul trucks coming from Virginia, a low tax state, are always coming into New York to sell untaxed tobacco. And that is really one of the major economic lessons here. Like, if you tax something too much, there's going to be a continued illicit market. Like, I'm sure there's people who still make moonshine, but it's not a plague on society. It's not hurting
just for family
Diageo's.
gatherings.
Right, yeah, exactly. Right. But so that's the lesson here. Like you want to tax something, but you don't want to tax it too much. And it's this kind of idea of like morality and like punishing people for seeking pleasure, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like, if you do that too much, then
we will seek our pleasure elsewhere.
Right.
Great.
Yeah.
Will Yakowicz, thank you very much.
Thank you, Diane.